me some truth.
The acid house scene in the UK went on to pave the way for the rave scene of the early 90s, which completely transformed the nightlife landscape of Britain. And in turn, as the years progressed, it just led to this worldwide phenomenon that we now have of electronic dance music being played in literally every country of the world. We have groups and agencies and institutions that deal with culture creation and social engineering, and they specialise in making sure culture goes off in certain desired directions that suit them and other groups that they represent. When you've got a movement like acid house and everything that it led to, there's no way that would have just evolved as per the official story. So that's my take on it. And there are some other interesting indicators that we come across as well. We had a lot of throwbacks to 60s kind of imagery in the flyers that were being used for these new events in the 80s. So here's one for an event at Theatre of Madness, which would have been at the Limelight, and it features this single eye design that originally appeared on a Grateful Dead poster going back to the 1960s. So we have another throwback to that earlier scene. This is a poster for the Grateful Dead. We have all kinds of mystical and metaphysical stuff going on. The pyramid there with the single eye, and that's all symbolism and imagery that cropped up again 21 years later. Timothy Leary, the acid guru of the 60s, this groovy Harvard professor who appeared to be down with the young people of the time and was encouraging them to drop acid and explore their consciousness and go on these amazing journeys of discovery, very much a key figure of the 60s scene with the phrase turn on, tune in, drop out. Turns out later in the day, when the research had been done into it, that Timothy Leary was a self-confessed asset of the CIA, which ties in with what we now know about how that whole scene was hijacked and infiltrated and steered off in certain desired directions.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Many references to Leary in some of these influential acid house records. So many of the tracks sampled his vocals. There was a club night featuring a guy called Divine Styler, who was described as the Timothy Leary of hip-hop, and just many other throwbacks and references to that 60s scene. These are all kind of little clues and indicators that what we may be looking at is a whole scene, a whole movement, a whole trend, which has been rebooted and repackaged for a new generation of young people in a different part of the world 21 years later. The detail and the names are different, but the story remains the same. Here's another poster for the Grateful Dead, going back to their heyday in the 60s, very similar to stuff that we would see on acid house flyers 21 years later. It's very interesting how the mainstream media dealt with that whole acid house phenomenon. The Sun newspaper, so-called, to start with, appeared to embrace it. So they had this article called It's Groovy and It's Cool, it's our acid house t-shirt. They were celebrating the whole movement, saying this is really cool, you know, get your t-shirt, folks, you know, don't get left behind. But very soon we started getting all these shock headlines coming from the Sun and other so-called newspapers. A very marked change in how the media was dealing with that whole scene. A record by the Easy Posse, everything starts with an E, get it? Some of these records were pretty unsubtle. People might remember the Shaman and their hit Ebenezer Good in 1992 with the hook line, Ease a good, ease a good. And they tried to make out they were talking about this character called Ebenezer Good, but I don't think anyone was fooled. These are some ecstasy pills. What happened after a few years was you started to get branded batches of them, and they would all come with their own engravings. So the bottom row, they were known as Mitsubishis because they used the familiar Mitsubishi logo. They were one of the most popular brand of e-pills. You've got the smiley yellow face ones on the second row down there. I think the idea behind these branded batches being put out into the market was so that they could be traced. And it seems to be the case that each pill came with its own different chemical constituents. And certain parties interested in how this whole thing went off would observe which e-pills would become the most popular. And the chemical constituents that had gone into them were then deemed to be the ones that, you know, the kids had taken to the most. So here we are with this massive worldwide party scene that by now has kicked off as the 80s give way to the 90s, and as the years progressed, more and more nations got in on the act, and the club dance scene just started to grow. You started to see festivals springing up in pretty much every country in the Western world and beyond. And you had a different breed of festival coming out. Again, when you look at the imagery going onto the flyers, you see similar kinds of icons and sigils cropping up, pyramids, the all-seeing eye, the Eye of Horus with a seal of Solomon going on there for one of the dance festivals. And in recent years, we've seen lots of imagery at these festivals, which to my mind very much ties in with transhumanism and this futurist AI smart grid type scenario that we're now seeing being rolled out in all areas of society. A lot of the namings of these dance events give clues. They're called things like Digital Dreams, Digital Awakening, Awakenings Festival, Tomorrowland, Future Music Festival. So it's all hinting at transhuman, digital, electronic ways of doing things being the future, planting this kind of imagery into the minds of very impressionable, malleable young people. There are various individuals that I detail in the book in terms of dance music DJs and producers and some of their more interesting background elements. One of them is a German DJ producer by the name of Paul van Dyk. He is someone that you'll find headlining all these festivals of the type that I've just mentioned, right up there at the top of the bill, and very much pushing transhumanist kind of imagery. Here he is at one of his concerts flashing up this very familiar hand sign, which is known as the horn hand or the devil horns. And here's a symbol that he's used for a very long time on his album covers and flyers and at his festival and club appearances. I'm puzzled for ages as to what the meaning of it could be. But I just happened, during the course of research, to come across an old logo that was used by British military intelligence, MI5, from the 1950s to the 1970s. And blow me, when you superimpose these two symbols together, or when you invert the Van Dyke one, I should say, inversion is a very key thing to how symbolism is used. But when you flip that symbol upside down, you see that it becomes very similar to the one that was being used by British military intelligence back in the day. You've got the two corners cut out the pyramid there, and on the MI5 version you've got the capstone of the pyramid with an all-seeing eye in it. Very interesting indeed. Turns out though that Van Dyke is not the only prominent dance music DJ producer to have used the same logo. Here we've got this guy Steve Aoki, who's a Japanese DJ producer, similarly massive, similarly highly influential, the same kind of symbol here, complete with the all-seeing eye in the capstone. Carl Cox, very popular DJ, he's been around since the early days of the rave scene in the UK. But when you look at some of the logos, the vector logos that are now being rocked by these key players that are leading this scene, many of them have occultic kind of overtones. This one, to me, looks very similar to an Egyptian winged sun disk. When you put two of those together, there's certainly some elements of that going on in the logo. Paul Oakenfold, one of the key instigators of the acid house scene, has two pyramids embedded into his name, the way it's rendered at all these dance festivals and stuff, as does Calvin Harris. Similarly, a massive worldwide name now. Carl Cox again, rocking some interesting imagery. He put out an album very early on in the 90s, and the acronym was FACT, which stood for Future Alliance of Communication and Technology, which seems to be a kind of precursor to this whole transhumanist AI agenda that we have going on now. Again, getting people familiar with it, getting it into the consciousness of young people. Armin van Buuren, who's a Dutch DJ producer, has a brand known as a state of trance, which could be taken two ways really. A state of trance could mean you're in a mental state, you've been induced into a trance, you've been coerced into it, but you could also take a state of trance to mean a nation state under the influence of a trance, or an aspect of mind control. I think there's probably a clue going on there. Subliminal imagery, sound frequency manipulation, mind-altering drugs. That's a pretty deadly combination in terms of opening yourself up to susceptibility to being manipulated.